You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Indonesia is the world's second largest producer of seaweed. Almost 40% of global supply comes from the province of South Sulawesi. This crop supports tens of thousands of coastal families. Production has surged. Exports are strong. Raw, unprocessed seaweed exports earn some $280 million for Indonesia. So it looks like a success story. But here's the question. If Indonesia's seaweed industry is booming, why do so many farmers still face unstable incomes, rising costs, and growing environmental risks? I'm Genevieve Woo, and joining me now to unpack this is CNA Correspondent Chandni Vatvani in Jakarta, who recently went to South Sulawesi for this story. Chandni, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Indonesia is the world's second largest producer of seaweed. Now, in 2023, the country exported some 250,000 tons of seaweed. And that is almost 6% increase from the year before in 2022. How and when did seaweed farming become such an important livelihood across coastal Indonesia?
That's right, Jen. Indonesia, of course, one of the largest seaweed producers in the world, ranking second after China. But if we talk about when seaweed farming became an important source of livelihood across Indonesia's coastal areas, we can trace its timeline back to the 1970s, 1980s, when initial commercial efforts to cultivate it first began. Now, interestingly, it was first introduced in Bali, and then in the 1990s, seaweed farming began expanding in other regions, and then the 2000 onwards, the industry rapidly expanded and seaweed became a major source of income for thousands of smallholder farmers. Of course, you've got other factors also in play. You have a growing appetite, global demand supported by the government, where you have government programs providing initial seedlings and equipment to boost activity as part of coastal development initiatives to reduce poverty as well. And gradually, we saw Indonesia replacing the Philippines as a leading producer, and the island of Sulawesi became the main production center. Now, for this assignment, I visited a village in South Sulawesi in Takala Regency called Punaga, and I encountered a farmer who told me that he was the very first seaweed farmer in that village back in the day. And this was very interesting because he told me how the very first seedlings that he brought into that village were from Bali, and it was the cottony variety. And I found this extremely fascinating because he was essentially confirming this very same timeline that we're talking about.
He moved from Bali to Sulawesi?
No, he's from Sulawesi. He went to Bali and got the seaweed and came back, brought it back to start his own business there.
Okay. And he is one of some 35,000 families, right, in the province of South Sulawesi who are employed in this industry. What makes seaweed so attractive to small-scale farmers, and how did so many become so dependent on this?
Yes, and that's only the last recorded figures, Jen. If we look at current production figures, the last data that we have from authorities is from 2024. So if we see the numbers, South Sulawesi in 2024 ranked first in terms of seaweed production in the country with an output of over 4 million tons, making the province a national seaweed barn. Now, the regency that we visited, Takala Regency itself, contributed some 15% of South Sulawesi's entire seaweed production. So in fact, the head of the Punaga village told me as well that majority of its residents are seaweed farmers too. So I would even venture that it's likely even more families have taken up this trade, and that 35,000 estimate may as well be higher now. But going back to the why, right? Why are so many people becoming seaweed farmers instead of, say, traditional fishermen, which, by the way, many still are, and oftentimes, and also what we saw on the ground, doing it together. So why do so many of them depend on it? To put it simply, it's a low startup cost, it's simple to execute, there's short production cycles, which are extremely profitable, and the seaweed needs to be harvested between 40 to 45 days in order for it to be of optimal quality and standard. Now you add to this mix Indonesia's natural advantages like its climate, large labor pool, extensive shallow coastal waters, coastline as well, if you compare to other coastlines, and all of these factors certainly very good motivators, and it has significantly improved socioeconomic conditions and reduced poverty in many coastal communities. Now, I also want to share that we actually saw and heard from many farmers there in South Sulawesi, in Punaga as well, and we heard so many stories of seaweed farmers who who previously, for example, and they were showing us, they previously owned homes made of wood and had homes on stilts and so on, but now they had concrete homes and brick homes, and they were able to better provide for their families.
The turnaround is just 40 to 50 days. That's pretty quick, harvest after harvest. So in terms of volume, it can churn up very quickly, isn't it?
That's absolutely true. In terms of volume, you would reap a lot more rewards compared to the initial investment that you would put in.
Right, exactly. And which is why it's such a success story. But on the flip side, many farmers still struggle. Yes, you're right. There are those success cases from wooden huts. They're now more concrete, like better housing. But can you give some insights on how much does a regular seaweed farmer earn? How stable is their income? And what are some factors for price or income instability?
Okay, to break this down, I want to start at the top. When we talk about the business having a low-level entry cost, what this means is, for example, a farmer would need, say, around $3,000 for 1 hectare's worth of seaweed. The investment is for purchasing the facilities and the infrastructure, such as the rope and the buoys. You don't need any fertilizer. And one cycle, as I mentioned, can reap rewards of, say, 3 times that initial investment. So once the production business is set up, what most farmers do is they either sell to middlemen who collect their harvests and then they sell it to the factories. So they're not actually directly selling to exporters per se. Next, we have the prices, right? So 1 kilogram in the current economic climate can be within the range of, say, 59 to 89 cents. But then you see the wet or moist seaweed is cheaper than dry seaweed. And then the issue then is the fact that these prices are so volatile and they fluctuate according to the market. For example, prices a few years ago, they hit nearly $3 for 1 kilogram. So I had a lot of farmers come and share their grievances to me about this, where they said the economy is not good. We had prices hit $3 and now we're selling it under $1. And so then there's also the issue after this of what next. What this means is that once they've sold their harvest, in order to cultivate their next batch, they need to have seedlings. But nurseries are not a given per se, and not all farmers have their own nurseries. So this means that they now have to buy seedlings or acquire them somehow. And so this is where authorities may step in to provide seaweed farmers with seedlings, among other necessities. Now, having said that, it was also very interesting for us to meet with some farmers who were getting quite innovative and creative in the sense that they went on to create their own nurseries. Take a listen.
Pada waktu itu, saya pikir,
At the time, I thought, how can I do this so I can have 3 or 4 harvests in 6 months? I thought I should build a nursery. So I built a nursery of around 700 seedlings, so I never run out.
Now, this particular seaweed farmer, Jen, was one of the success stories that we came across. And not only was he successful, but he was helping to supply seedlings by selling them to other seaweed farmers in his village. Now, he shared with us how he had put all of his children through college with his earnings from seaweed farming, including their master's degree.
China is the single largest buyer of Indonesia's raw, unprocessed seaweed. 88% of Indonesia's seaweed is exported to China. Isn't that interesting? China is the world's largest producer, and it is buying 88% from the world's second largest producer. What is China doing with all that seaweed?
That is absolutely true, Jen. Over 80% of the country's seaweed, dried seaweed and carrageenan, is exported to China. And you know what? It's not for domestic consumption.
I was thinking about that. They can't be eating all that seaweed.
No, and that's really fascinating because, you know, what they're actually doing is Indonesia's tropical red seaweed, which is Indonesia's specialty, is what China needs for industrial scale processing in sectors like food. For example, they would use seaweed in dairy products or bakeries, baked goods, for example, or instant noodles, sauces, and beverages. So you have carrageenan, agar, and other hydrocolloids. They're all used in various food products. And then you also have, aside from this industry, there are other industries as well, like pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. So you've got seaweed then being processed and being used in hair products like shampoo, or beauty products like skincare. And there's seaweed also being used for biopackaging fertilizers, animal feed additives. You said earlier that the largest producer is importing from the second largest producer. It's also worth noting, I must say, that Indonesia and China, I think we could say that what they have is a complementary relationship, whereby you have Indonesia producing the raw material with limited processing capacity, while China, on the other hand, has a large processing industry.
So this Indonesia's seaweed certainly feeds into China's massive manufacturing export output. And we know China export a lot of food products, and they're also a major player in the beauty and cosmetics sector too. More than 80% of Indonesia's exports go to China, which means they have one single major buyer overseas. I mean, that to me sounds there's a vulnerability there. How exposed are farmers when prices fall or demand changes suddenly?
Based on our experience of visiting South Sulawesi and speaking to farmers and industry players there, it's really not ideal, and they are certainly exposed and they are certainly vulnerable. And for the farmers, you could say that they're basically at the mercy of the market. And another contributing reason as to why Indonesia is competitive in the international seaweed market is also because if we look at the purchasing power of international currency, it's essentially high in Indonesia, and what this means is that labor is cheaper compared to other countries where oftentimes low prices don't necessarily cover production costs. So it's really not ideal.
So from a national perspective, from the policy makers, are there plans to diversify buyers to reduce this risk?
This is a really interesting question, because in the course of doing these series of stories, I spoke with many people, and one of whom was the Secretary General of the Indonesian Seaweed Association. And this was one of the perspectives that he shared as well in terms of over-reliance and lack of diversification. Now, he says that from a national perspective, the domestic market is still extremely limited. He goes on to tell me that there needs to be more effort where research is concerned for a more competitive, if you will, future. And so he shared his perception that he felt there was a huge gap if we compare Indonesia to other countries and what those countries have done for their markets in replacing, for example, say artificial additives or other ingredients, and how they've replaced those ingredients with seaweed. And he went on to explain that if Indonesia just put more effort into finding out which components in food products and others can be substituted or replaced by seaweed, that would certainly give farmers, industry players, and of course the Indonesian economy a big boost. Take a listen as to what he had to say.
Kekurangan di kami di industri dalam negeri itu,
our shortcoming in the domestic industry is that the R&D allocation is very, very small. So maybe we come from a tradesman background and we enter a really different industry. Prior to COVID, I visited colleagues in the industry almost every year, you could say, including the BLG headquarters. I saw their labs and all kinds of research. So they take products that are on the market and then form small groups to research how to incorporate seaweed into those products and include it in the product formulation, both for food and beverages. In Japan, it's the same.
I just want to add also that in 2017, one of the world's biggest seaweed processing companies from China, BLG, opened a processing factory in South Sulawesi. Now, whether there is anything concrete being done for diversification, at this point, it's a wait-and-see situation.
Your report also covers the environmental impact of seaweed farming. There's widespread use of plastic bottle buoys in this farming. Can you briefly explain how this works and why is it now a problem?
Yes, cultivating seaweed involves seedlings, right? Attached onto ropes or nets and then casting them out in the sea or very large tanks under controlled conditions. Now, the plastic bottles come into play when seaweed farmers are cultivating seaweed in the ocean. The plastic buoys, which as we saw in South Sulawesi are the one-time use, single-use plastic water bottles, they are repurposed as dedicated floats or buoys. Now, the buoys are vital in seaweed cultivation for what is known as the long line method, which is attaching the seedlings to a long rope, which is what I mentioned earlier. So in this method, farmers then keep seaweed lines suspended using the buoys at optimal depths, preventing them from sinking as the seaweed grows. And as the seaweed gets heavier, they would be attaching more buoys to it to keep it afloat. And so they keep the seaweed near the surface for sunlight. The seedlings also then have adequate spacing, and which are adjusted by weights and floats to maintain buoyancy and provide access points for farmers. Now, as to why this is an environmental issue, when millions of seaweed farmers across the archipelago use plastic buoys, especially single-use bottles, it then contributes to microplastic pollution and marine debris, which of course pose a huge environmental challenge.
And if left unchecked, what might happen to the environment?
Well, it could certainly lead to several very concerning consequences. You have microplastic pollution, where exposure to, for example, UV radiation and wind and waves and other things causes plastic buoys to age, and they break down into smaller fragments, and they would eventually become microplastics. Of course, microplastics, as we all know, is a significant source of pollution in farming areas. It can also be ingested by marine organisms, including the farmed seaweed itself, which could then transfer to humans through consumption. You also have marine debris, litter, where you have damaged or old buoys and other plastic farming gear frequently discarded or lost and getting accumulated, again going back to harm marine life. You also have habitat damage, ecosystem disruption. And then if we look at how it affects the seaweed itself, all of these elements could certainly negatively impact growth, resulting in lower quality, less harvests, and ultimately reduced incomes because of an unstable supply.
Absolutely. And authorities are aware of this, aren't they? And they are doing something to address this?
Well, they certainly are. The South Sulawesi provincial government is replacing plastic buoys, the single-use plastic buoys, with high-density polyethylene ones as part of a campaign to cultivate environmentally friendly seaweed in the area. Now, the way this works is that they have been handing out HDPE ones to farmers to test out first. HDPE is a recyclable, durable thermoplastic and can be reused far more than the single-use plastic bottles can. So you have seaweed farmers, they've been asked to exchange their single-use plastic bottles for these HDPE ones, and the single-use plastic bottles are then sold to scrap collectors, and the proceeds from that sale are given to the farmers as a reward for their hard work. Having said that, I spoke to M. Ilyas, who is the head of South Sulawesi's Maritime Affairs and Fisheries Agency, and an important thing that he shared with me was that authorities were also hoping to educate farmers on how they can cut back and the importance of cutting back on pollution through this initiative. Take a listen.
Jadi itu inovasi yang kita lakukan adalah
what we're doing is encouraging these farmers to be environmentally friendly, and they should be. This isn't just about replacing the plastic buoys. More importantly, it's about transformation. We're transforming the farmers' knowledge about plastic, a pollutant in the ocean, and they need to reduce it. And this is an example of what education is all about.
Jen, we had a really interesting journey getting onto location for this particular story. Now, the first phase of distribution by authorities for this project was in the Luwu Raya region, and we were based in Makassar for this assignment. And so to get to that location, we had to take an overnight bus, which took us around 12 and a half to 13 hours. We got to our location, so we left at 6 p.m. We got there, I think it was 6:30 a.m. the next morning, and then we got off the bus, into a car, onto a boat, because we were trying to get all of our filming done before it started raining. The weather wasn't very conducive, and then we finished filming just as it began raining. We wrapped everything up by 2 p.m., and then we took the same overnight bus back, 12 to 13 hour bus back to Makassar. It was certainly an experience, I'll say that.
Sounds like, well, it's not the journey, it's the destination. Or is it the other way around? You got to look deep into this very cool topic, I think, and you got to talk to the farmers. And beyond prices, farmers face all these challenges: climate, environmental, and selling to middlemen, and they have the risk of one single major buyer. What would you say would be the biggest uncertainties that they face?
You know, it boils down to three factors, really. It's prices, continuity, and improvement. Seaweed farmers are thinking, how can the prices get better? How can I continue to do what I do? And how can I earn more? How can I do better for myself so I can provide better for my family? And it's also because some of the farmers that we talked to, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation, the cycle to get an optimal in terms of quality and standard, you need to harvest it between 40 and 45 days. And so what's happening is you have seaweed farmers who are just, say you have to harvest it after a month, so say a month and a half, right? But what's happening is seaweed farmers, because they are on certain occasions they need the money, for example, they're harvesting earlier. So they're sacrificing quality, but because they need the money, which would not happen if they felt secure in all of those three factors.
On that note, thank you, Chandni, for the insights of Indonesia as the world's second largest seaweed producer after China. We began this episode by asking why a booming seaweed industry still leaves so many farmers feeling uncertain. Indonesia's seaweed story isn't just about exports and numbers, it's about how global demand reshapes local lives and whether sustainability can strengthen rather than slow down that growth. So, can Indonesia build a seaweed industry that rewards farmers, protects its coastal environment, and still compete in a fast-moving global market, or will growth continue to come at a hidden cost? Thanks for joining me on this episode of the CNA Correspondent Podcast. It's brought to you by Clara Ong, Tiffany Ang, Nat Betavero, Craig Dale, and me, Genevieve Woo. Bye for now.